Captain, we have them! We've established Transporter Lock, the Star Trek podcast. Join Ken and Sabriel each week as they explore strange new episodes, seek out new plots and new characters, and boldly go where no podcast has gone before.
Hello and welcome to Transporter Lock for Season 2 of Prodigy. I am your Chief Engineer, Ken Gagne, and I am joined by a very special guest.
I'm First Officer Tiffany Bridge.
Hello, Tiffany. It is so wonderful to have you back on the show.
Ken, I'm so excited to be back.
You were here, I think, in 2020 to talk about a Season 3 episode of Discovery, and then in 2022 to talk about the first season of Prodigy. And you are now back not as a guest, but as a co-host to talk about every episode in Season 2 of Prodigy.
The only promotion that matters. Promoted from guest to co-host.
It's true. I mean, look at how long Will Riker was number one. You should be happy with that position. I know I would be.
Number one on the flagship is better than captain anywhere else.
I think that's a fair assessment. It is. However, if you are interested in your career advancement, there is one question I have to ask you, something that you do need to know. Have you read Temporal Mechanics 101?
Not yet, but since episode 4 this season is called Temporal Mechanics 101, I have a feeling it's in my future.
Oh, a little, or it could be in your past.
Or in my past. I won't know until I read Temporal Mechanics 101.
So Prodigy Season 2 is doing something that has never been done in Star Trek, which is dropping an entire season all at once. All 20 half-hour episodes in Season 2 of Prodigy landed on Netflix on July 1st. There are people out there who have already seen all of them. You and I are going to be watching 2 episodes at a time and recording a podcast for each 2 episodes. We don't know exactly the frequency. It might be weekly. It might be more often than that. But we're going to try to keep it lively so that people who have already binged it all aren't too far ahead of us. But for now, tonight, we're talking about Into the Breach, Part 1 and Part 2.
It was a little bit of a struggle to not immediately move on, but I didn't want to get ahead of you.
Well, you know, Netflix, it just immediately flows into the next episode, and you have to make a conscious effort not to do that.
Yeah, we were diving for the remote.
And we being?
My husband, Tom, and my son, Charlie.
Ah, so this is a family affair.
It is. We watched this together. We were very excited that there was a kid-focused Star Trek. Though, honestly, since he was just a little guy, we've been watching, like, 90s Trek with him. Because that sort of 90s primetime network TV level of content seems pretty child appropriate most of the time. A little early on, he was stressed out by the makeup, like the Ferengi and the Klingons. But now that he's a little older, he enjoys watching that with us. We've also watched all of Voyager with him, so which is a great tie-in for the season of Prodigy.
For all seasons of Prodigy, I kind of feel like this is like a side door into a Voyager sequel. Like they call it Prodigy, but it's really Voyager 2.
Right. I mean, the first season very much kind of took place sort of, you know, alongside but tangential to what we think of as like the main Trek continuity, right? Like there was a Janeway, but mostly it was like hologram Janeway. So it was easy to sort of think of this as its own thing. But this season, with putting us back on a ship called Voyager, commanded by Catherine Janeway, with the Doctor, right? Like, I really feel like this show is now like staking its claim. It's like, no, we're part of the canon, y'all. Like, we are a Trek show. We stand next to all the other Trek shows.
Yep. And they're trying to rescue Chakotay. So there's...
Exactly.
Yeah, they're bringing back all the hits. And Chakotay made some appearances in the first season, usually in flashbacks or recordings, but he is getting top billing. Like in the opening credits, Robert Beltran, Robert Picardo.
Yeah, series regulars. So we should be expecting to hear from them quite a bit this season.
Yeah, so let's start there. What do you think about the fact that right off the bat, not holding anything back, they bring back the holographic Doctor from Voyager for this season?
Look, when those turbo lift doors opened and it was the doctor standing there, I squealed a little bit. I was so excited to see him.
Was it a surprise?
It was a surprise. I went into the season knowing nothing except what had happened in the previous season, right? I didn't seek out any spoilers or anything like that. So I didn't know he was coming, and I got really excited because I developed a real affection for the doctor. And I just think Robert Picardo is a lovely man, and I always like to see him working. So that was exciting. But I also, related to all that, I really felt like this season, or this first episode rather, in addition to kind of reestablishing our main cast, it also, like, I don't know how many references to the rest of the Trek canon it made in the space of like 10 minutes. But I have had a running tally, right? Because we had, let's see, in addition to like the cast members, right? The Doctor, Janeway, Chakotay, we also had like references to Picard, Cetacean Ops, the Delta Quadrant, Nova Squadron. Like it just kept going. And it was like, in case you didn't know, we know all of the canon. And so we hope you do too. Like straight up assigning Rock Talk to Cetacean Ops. Like, come on, you're really like referencing the whales. Awesome.
Yeah, which we'd only ever seen on Lower Decks before, and it would take another animated series to show us that.
And then we saw them this time. We saw them in the second episode as they're like chasing through the ship. We saw the whales.
Mm-hmm. They also mentioned that the rest of Starfleet was busy with the Romulan evacuation. So that helps us cement where in the timeline this is, because when they first mentioned a wormhole, it's been a couple of years since I saw the first season of Prodigy. I forgot some details. I forgot that the Protostar had made a wormhole. So the wormhole I was thinking of was the one at the end of season 2 of Picard. And I was like, oh, wait, that's actually like 5 years from now or 20 years from now. So that it's not that wormhole. This is like just before the ban on synthetics goes into place. And the planet Romulus still exists, and the star hasn't gone supernova, and the Kelvin universe hasn't been created yet. So that's where we are in the timeline. So just that one quick reference, I was like, okay, as somebody who follows Trek, this cements it very firmly at this point in the timeline.
Exactly. Like they mentioned, she mentioned promising Picard that she wouldn't lose this Voyager in the Delta Quadrant. I'm like, okay, so Picard is around and to ask those questions. We got a reference to Admiral Jellicoe, who, is messing with our heroes' missions. I'm like, why is it always Jellicoe? Right? He's like also a jerk in any part of the timeline, much like Nova Squadron. So so they really kind of laid the references to the lore on thick, like almost like they're daring you to call this not real Trek, right?
Yeah.
So which I'm always here for. I'm always ready for people to demonstrate that they're cred, right?
Especially given that Prodigy was canceled from Paramount Plus and had to find a new home on Netflix. They're kind of like saying, we belong with all the other shows that we were not allowed to belong with on streaming media. Even though we're over here, we're just as good as the ones over there.
We are very much like claiming our place next to all the other tiles in the Paramount Plus app, whether they're there or not.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're sitting at the kiddie table at Thanksgiving, but you're more mature than the ones at the adult table.
For sure.
Yeah, I was very excited to see Robert Picardo back as well. I think I knew that was coming. I think I may have read it somewhere online, which is one reason why some of my friends are binging all 20 episodes, is because they think that's the only way to avoid spoilers. If they don't see them all right away, something on social media is going to ruin it for them.
I mean, look, it's 2024. Avoiding information I don't want to read on social media has kind of become an art form. So I think I'm going to be okay.
Yeah,
but I am excited to get through the season.
Yeah, I'm glad that we don't need to wait 20 weeks, because you may recall that Prodigy season 1 was split into 2 halves. They aired 10 episodes, waited forever, and then aired another 10 episodes. And so they just swung the pendulum from one extreme to the other. They're like, fine, here, have everything.
Well, my understanding of that split in the first season is that they actually just weren't done making the second half of the season. They had to stop and finish them. which I'm kind of glad is not the case this time, because I always feel like whenever there's a pause and a show is unfinished, that's always the opportunity for somebody to pull the plug on it.
Yes.
So I love that this is out there. There's all of it. I can consume all of it. And I don't have to worry about that. Because, and we've talked about this before, the animation style of this show is so beautiful. Like the animation of space and the animation of the characters, like it's just so beautiful. It's really just a pleasure to look at. So, and that stuff doesn't come fast or cheap or easy, right? It's nice to see the care that's taken with the art on this show.
Just to bounce back for a sec, another reason why they may have been able to drop everything all at once on Netflix instead of the way they did it on Paramount Plus, because with Paramount Plus, they had to coordinate with all the other Star Trek shows that were airing. Okay, like so
Sure.
Picard in Q1, Strange New Worlds in Q2, Lower Decks in Q3, Prodigy in Q4. And now they're like, you know what? Now we got our own sandbox to play in. We can do whatever we want. Go air your shows when you want. We're going to do everything all at once.
It still got drafted after Discovery was over, though.
This is true.
Like there's no new Trek currently being released except for this.
Maybe they knew it was in their own best interest to not compete with their own franchise.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's great. I think dropping a kid-focused show in July makes a lot of sense, right?
That's true.
Because, let's be honest, there's a lot of parents who, for one reason or another, need to occupy their children for short periods of time with something wholesome. And, a kid-focused Trek series is just the thing.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of being kid-focused, and you've mentioned Nova Squadron, there are a lot of kids on this show. There's Nova Squadron. There are the 5 stowaways from last season. Why? I mean, is it just a plot device that Janeway chose to bring so many cadets on this mission? Because you don't normally see ungraduated Starfleet cadets on a Starfleet vessel.
Well, if you are, and honestly, our heroes, I think, have not even gotten into the academy yet, right? Like they're like special interns or something. They're like Janeway's personal intern squad. But I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is, if we remember the lessons of the Kelvin timeline, when there is an enormous planetary evacuation happening and an emergency, a lot of times cadets are indeed pressed into service, and some of them even end up in command of starships. So you're shaking your head at me, and I know. It's not less ridiculous. So I certainly think that's part of it. They're busy with the Romulan evacuation. There's just going to be less crew available to do this, right? They brought out the holographic doctor for this. So I don't want to say they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. That sounds pejorative, but they don't have the plethora of trained, experienced Starfleet personnel at their disposal that they might have. And so, yeah, they're going to go with Nova Squadron because they're supposed to be the best, even though, man, every time we see Nova Squadron, they like devolve into some sort of nonsense, and no one has learned yet that you can't trust Nova Squadron. And then, of course, we've got our friends because the Protostar is involved, and no doubt they're going to be a potentially important source of intelligence on the mission. And of course, there's also the plot device, which is children like to watch shows about children. They don't like to watch shows about grown-ups.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to want to have like your schoolyard bullies as well as your heroes.
I think they are in Starfleet Academy. I remember at the end of season 1, they were told they could all apply except for the Volnikat young
Dal.
No, Dal was allowed in.
Wasn't he? Was a man. I should have gone back and rewatched the finale. But they spent the entire episode talking about, if we do this, we might not get into the academy, or we have to prove that we're good enough to get into the academy. That said, I mean, Rock Talk was out there like solving major Federation problems at the beginning of the episode, right? Like she figured out how to stop tribbles from reproducing. which no one has been able to do. Speaking of references to the canon, Rock Talk figures out how to stop tribbles from reproducing.
Of course. I was a little disappointed that Dal, of all people, like I on one hand is totally in character that he doesn't like studying, he doesn't want to read books. Okay, I get it. But he spent most of season one hoping and wishing and praying that he could get into the academy. And at the end of the season one, he gets his wish, his dream comes true. He's allowed into the academy, and once he's there, he doesn't want to do the work to stay there. Like, what did he think Starfleet Academy was going to be like?
I mean, these kids grew up with no particular concept of Starfleet, right? And so I see him as sort of, again, not to lead too hard on the Kelvin timeline, but I see him a little bit as like our friend, like Kelvin timeline Kirk, right? Sort of assuming that a certain amount of charm and swagger will get it. I could totally see Dal like reprogramming the Kobayashi Maru simulation, right? Like that seems entirely in character for him. So, and I think, you know, and to his point, like he's already commanded a starship for like a year, right? And we see that in this episode as well, that he's sort of chafing under this like reduction in status. Now all of a sudden he's like the cadet and he's never going to see Janeway, and whereas he's accustomed to like running the whole ship. And so I don't, it doesn't, I think it bothers me less that he doesn't want to do the studying because he's like, what do I need to do all that? I already know everything I need to know. I've already commanded the starship. Put me in, coach.
Yeah, I was thinking of that in context of how they are currently developing a Starfleet Academy TV show. At the beginning of Into the Breach Part 1, I thought, this is not very interesting. I'm not interested in these characters being in school. And Dal, to your point, explained in his own words why it wasn't interesting. Because they've already done all the things that Starfleet Academy is training them to do. I think an actual Starfleet Academy show, now that Dal has pointed that out to me, will be interesting because the characters are starting there. You know, it's kind of like if you've ever played one of the Metroid Prime video games, like Samus Aran, this galaxy famous bounty hunter, starts the game with all of her power-ups, and then she loses them. And you spend the rest of the game getting them back one by one. And I kind of feel like that's what they did with Prodigy, where they gave the kids all the power-ups in season one. And at the beginning of season two, they're taking them away. And we see them starting to get them back by the end of Into the Breach Part 2 because, oh, now they have a starship again.
Right. I think that's true. And, you know, something that like authors sometimes talk about is the tendency in like long series, like fantasy type novels, is for the main character just gets like so overpowered over time. Like the stakes just have to keep getting higher and higher and higher in order for them to have any meaning. And so a popular choice is to sort of like reset the board, take everything away. And now this person has started and you see this in all kinds of media, right? If you think about like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Iron Man 3, right? Like what happens when you take the Iron Man suit away from Tony Stark? What's he have left? And you see it, I mean, you see it in all kinds of media. And I think there is a little bit of that here. Like these kids like learn to run this extremely cutting edge, like bleeding edge starship. And now they're the kids and they have to like obey orders, and they're getting bossed around by someone that they like, but they're accustomed to the hologram version of her, not necessarily the flesh and blood version of her. They're accustomed to the training hologram, and this is like the real Janeway. This is Catherine Janeway, who has never seen something she didn't think she could ram a ship into if she needed to, right? This is Janeway who murdered Tuvix. This is Catherine. Let's do a whole murder Janeway, and I don't think that they're necessarily prepared for what that means and for the difference between training Janeway and real flesh and blood Janeway.
That's a good point. When they first encountered Janeway in season one, they thought, oh, this is going to be somebody that we will like. And Janeway was instead, oh, you're the fugitives that stole my starship, who I'm trying to capture and bring to justice. And they're like, wait, what? We thought you were like a friendly parental type figure to us. And the reality was very different. So yeah, they are going to have probably a couple of rude awakenings in this season.
They're going to have to come to terms with who Janeway really is. And we know Janeway. We've been through several seasons of Voyager with Janeway. We know Janeway, we respect Janeway, but she's not anybody's mom. And here's a bunch of kids who haven't quite figured out how they're going to relate to her yet.
Yeah. Which is why I thought it was interesting to bring the Doctor back, because last season they had hologram Janeway and now they have hologram Doctor. And I wonder if in some way he's like filling the void left by the destruction of hologram Janeway.
And I think that may be possible as well, particularly since we've already seen this Doctor become quite a mentor, right? He was a mentor to Seven of Nine, for example, on Voyager. And so I think he already has that as part of his programming, but he also has all of those years of Voyager experience that make him extremely useful in a fight, right? He is more than surpassed his original parameters, and he's got that sort of mentorship thing happening as well. And so I think I'm hoping that we'll see some more of that this season, because these kids, just because Janeway doesn't have time to mentor them doesn't mean they don't need mentoring.
However, as good a mentor as he is, as Zero pointed out, he is a terrible actor.
Indeed. The Doctor always has been.
I thought she was just going to say he's a terrible liar, which, yeah, that's pretty obvious. But I was kind of surprised and maybe a little disappointed at how ham-fisted and obvious that was. He's like, oh, I meant Shuttlecraft 2. What am I saying? Shuttlecraft 3. Like, there is no Shuttle Bay 3. And that seemed like something Dal would say, which Dal later did say, but we were getting it from the Doctor.
So then that does raise a point, though. Are we going to find out that maybe is the Doctor such a bad actor after all? Or was he planted? Did he want the kids to find out what was happening because he disagreed with Janeway's decision to keep them out of it? I mean, how deep does the rabbit hole go, right? Like maybe Janeway wanted it leaked to them. We don't know. We've only seen 2 episodes. And I would not put anything past the 2 of them if they thought it was going to further their mission, right?
I too was wondering if there was some undisclosed reason why these cadets in particular were brought on this mission, and that maybe they were leaked intentionally into this mission. However, there have been many times where my previous co-host Sabriel and I had conspiracy theories about Star Trek,
Sure.
and they almost never played out.
To theorize, though. Like, I'm always going to enjoy coming up with it.
Sure. I mean, since you and I have seen only the first 2 episodes, headcanon is all we have so far.
But I really enjoyed this first episode as like let's just sort of reintroduce everybody, right? Like, remember Murph? Here's Murph. Murph, who is apparently a secret ninja. Like, that's probably my favorite gag in the whole thing is Murph and his love for weapons. And how everybody agrees that he belongs in security training. Like, just fantastic. It's the best. So I'm looking forward to more. I mean, even if it just becomes like a running gag and never actually has plot impact, I'm so here for it. Yeah, it was nice to get back and like kind of reset everybody, and then like, okay, now let's introduce everybody to like the main points of Voyager. Here's Janeway. Here's the Doctor. Here's what happened to the first ship called Voyager. And let's meet this, Bolian first officer voiced by Daveed Diggs, and see that he's going to be the one who's maybe a little bit suspicious of them this whole time. And he's going to be the one they have to win over. And that was great too. So, but that first half hour is really about like, let's just reestablish all of our relationships and all of our timelines and everything, and kind of get things going. I did something that we haven't touched on yet. I really enjoyed that moment between Dal and Gwyn. And he's sitting there starting to like get vulnerable and talk about his feelings, and he's not getting anything back. And it turns out that the video call is frozen. Like, that is just a uniquely like 2020s kind of gag for all of us, because we've all been in those meetings. I really enjoyed the deployment of that particular bit of awkwardness in this context.
Yeah, she was so stone-faced. I had to imagine like something is going on here. That's not actually her reacting. Either she's possessed or the video froze.
Right.
Yeah. So she went back to her home world, or I really shouldn't say back because she's never been there. And
Sure.
she is trying to be an emissary and stop a civil war that hasn't happened. And she got beat to the punch by Essentia, who I didn't actually remember from the first season. I had to go back on YouTube and watch some, I guess I could have on Netflix and watch some clips. I was like, oh, yeah, her. I remember now. She was pretending to be a Trill. She was undercover in Starfleet, blah, blah, blah. That it all came back to me. But I kind of wish how with some Star Trek episodes, they start off with last time on Star Trek, and there's a 1 minute recap. I kind of wish, even though they laid all the groundwork, as you said, for this season, a brief last season on Prodigy would have helped me remember who all the players were as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much TV now, and there's so much Trek. And if the target audience for the show is children, like, are they going to remember who Essentia is? Like, Essentia didn't get an action figure like the other cast members did. So yeah, is anybody going to remember who it took me a second, but I did eventually remember that there was another Vaunicott on Janeway's ship, actually, and who had been working against them. So yeah, so Gwyn shows up, addresses the Vaunicott elders, who kind of had like a Pan's Labyrinth thing going on with their costuming, and turns out her extremely like xenophobic culture is still extremely xenophobic even before the Federation shows up, surprising no one but except perhaps Gwyn. And I thought that, that the chase through the alleys kind of felt very like Star Wars-y to me. Like I just sort of, oh, she's headed for the bazaar, and I just got like a Star Wars vibe off of it for a second, which is not a bad thing. It's just a little bit of kind of crossing of the streams. I did not expect her to go straight for her father, though. That surprised me.
It never even occurred to me until after I saw her face start glowing. And I didn't remember from season 1 if that meant anything in particular, but I thought, what is she connected to on this planet that could possibly cause that to happen? And then I thought, Essentia just showed off her younger self. That probably means that her father has a younger version of himself here too.
Yeah. And it was, it was nice to see them actually, like, it was nice to see the nice version of him, right? Like he was so awful for all of season 1 that it was nice to get this like younger, unburdened version of Gwyn's father.
Yeah, in season 1, I remember there was an early episode where they were on the planet with the vines that made you imagine things. And he had one moment where he had to choose between his daughter and the protostar, and he went for the protostar. I'm like, okay, you are very unredeemably a bad father. But then at the end of season 1, he actually ends up saving Gwyn, and he dies in his attempt to do so. Spoiler. So I don't know what prompted that arc per se. I'd probably have to go back and rewatch season 1, but I feel like there had to have been a germ of a good person in that character for him to have eventually saved his daughter at the end of season 1. And now in season 2, we're seeing where that came from.
Yeah, it's interesting to see his origin, and interesting to contemplate, like an alternate future for him, where he doesn't have to, enslave teenagers on the what is it, I can't ever remember if it Tars Lamora.
Sure.
Sure. And to dig up the protostar, right? It's nice to imagine like this alternate future. So, while she's out doing that, of course, our heroes get read into the secret mission. And I just felt like, and this is what's feeding my conspiracy theory, right? Because who thinks Dal can keep a secret? Who thinks that? Not this girl. Why would Janeway think that? And like Dal, like already, like he's barely out of the observatory, the conference room. He's barely out of the conference room before he's like unable to keep his mouth shut about it. And I feel like it can't be like, oh no, Dal spilled the beans. Like that can't have come as a surprise to anyone. And then, of course, Nova Squadron and here's why Nova Squadron is on the ship, right? But what I thought was interesting about it was the way that, like, first of all, Dal, really, you're just gonna like take the super secret cloak ship that you're only barely supposed to know about, open the hangar, and just bloop it into the shuttle bay to hide it from. Like that plan was ludicrous as soon as it was coming out of his mouth. But I thought it was interesting the way that the ship got automatically launched with half of our heroes on it, and like that one person from Nova Squadron. I think that'll be interesting to see what happens. When they kind of mix up the groups of kids a little bit. And are we going to see Dal become friends with the head of Nova Squadron? Or are we going to see, like, what are we going to see here?
Yeah, that's one of the notes I took, which is in Dungeons and Dragons, you never split the party. And that's what they've done here. So they actually have characters that we need to follow along with in 3 different places. They have the cloaked ship that is going in 51 or 52 years into the future. They have those who are left behind on Voyager 2 or Voyager B, A, whatever you want to call it. And we have the Volnikat planet where they're trying to stop a civil war. So these 3 things all need to tie into each other somehow at some point. And it'll be interesting to see how they do that. I mean, they have 20 episodes in which to do it. And even though they're only half-hour episodes, so that comes out to about 10 one-hour episodes, which is typical for Star Trek this time of year or whatever. But I feel like Prodigy moves a little bit faster than even the 1-hour shows do, because within 30 minutes, that has to be a self-contained story. So they have like 20 self-contained stories.
Right. So 20 short stories. You're targeting these stories towards, children's attention spans. So you have to keep the action moving. You don't get the sort of the ponderousness of it. So it'll be interesting. Like they went straight for like, oops, we've accidentally like right into the action, right? Oops, we've accidentally launched this ship 41 hours too early. We got to figure out how to get it back. Janeway's being warned not to go into the wormhole. Who's warning Janeway not to go into the wormhole? Is it going to turn out that that's like Dal from the other side of the wormhole? Who knows? I don't know. There's a lot of open questions. I'm excited.
I definitely think whatever that giant balloon was that appeared in front of Janeway was some sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, kind of like the Red Angel from Discovery Season 2, because just before Dal's ship went into the wormhole, the thing showed back up and said, like a minute ago, it was saying, don't go into the wormhole, all will be lost. And then it shows up and says, now is the time. And the ship goes in right when it says to.
It's a time travel plot. There's definitely going to be some sort of timey-wimey, paradoxical, like clever twist with that balloon, right? Like this, like why even have a time travel plot if you aren't going to have some sort of like reveal like that at the end? I feel like it's almost required. Like what even is the point? Because we've got this. I've been watching like Doctor Who. We had the time travel plot in Discovery. Like it's a trope. And I don't say that in a bad way. I think tropes can be valuable, especially in children's media, right? Where they aren't necessarily as jaded to it as the adults are yet.
And you just did something that Dal also did, which was quote Doctor Who. All this timey-wimey stuff makes my head hurt.
Are we going to talk about the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff?
I mean, the writers had to have known what they were doing when they wrote that line.
Yeah, I mean, as with all good children's media, there's always going to be references that are meant for the adults. So, and I just assumed that was one of them. Similarly, Rock saying, "The Jeffries tube always leads to trouble." Like, you're not wrong. A Jeffries tube does always lead to trouble. You are correct about that.
But did you notice how spacious they are now? You don't even need to crawl on your hands and knees.
Yes. Yeah, that was one of my notes. And well, because I was thinking about that for a couple of reasons. First of all, they just seemed more like the access tunnels on Deep Space Nine, right? Like the access tunnels, the access corridors on Deep Space Nine were like whole extra corridors, right? O'Brien's in there like moving tools around. People are in there talking to him, and it's like the Jeffries tubes on this Voyager are like that as well. But one of the reasons that stuck out to me was because early on in the first episode, as they're stepping into a turbo lift, Rock Talk, who's this giant creature, has to sort of step sideways into the turbo lift, and I was like, can we get this poor humanoid some doors that fit her body, please?
Right.
And then I noticed that she's just moving freely around the Jeffries tubes. It's not a problem for her, which I was pleased about. Like, we love the accessibility of the Jeffries tube. But that I did notice how big they were, that they could all just sort of walk around through them.
Your favorite gag that referred back to a social interaction that we have these days, or a social event, was the Zoom video call freezing. My favorite one was people getting on and off the elevator so that Nova Squadron couldn't get to where they were going as quickly as they wanted.
Yeah, they were like, oh, we have to beat Nova Squadron to the hangar, so let's take the Jeffries tube. And I'm like, when is Jeffries tube ever a shortcut? But then it was a whole gag.
Right.
With like the most trafficked turbo lift on the entire ship, apparently.
Because the doctor had just finished saying, oh, these aren't elevators, they're turbo lifts. And then we show it acting just like an elevator nowadays.
It's like an elevator, but it's turbo. Except that it isn't, because it's still an elevator. And people are, I kept waiting for somebody to do the equivalent of like stepping on the elevator and hitting all the buttons, like just to mess with them. So, yeah, because I was like, in what universe is the Jeffries tube a shortcut? And then there was a whole gag about it, and I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah. So going back to the timey-wimey stuff, I feel like this show wants it both ways. They want to have their cake and eat it too, because on one hand, we have the Volnicott planet where they're trying to stop a civil war that hasn't happened yet. So they're trying to change the timeline there. On the other hand, they don't want to go through the wormhole too soon, because if they do, they'll change the timeline on the other side of the wormhole. But what's on the other side of the wormhole requires that the Civil War happen. So I feel like they're trying to change one timeline and not the other when it's really all the same thing.
Yeah, I thought about that as well. And it's too early for me to know if that's on purpose or not, or if it's just like hand-wavy stuff, right? I don't know, because I felt like for example, to again reference the MCU, when you're watching Avengers Endgame, they make a big deal out of talking about like the different branching timelines and how you have to snip the timelines off, and you can't do anything to like send us off into another timeline. And then you get to the end of the movie, and Steve Rogers just gets to go back to his own time and live a whole life, which would presumably branch off a timeline, except then he's back in the main time. Like, it didn't make any sense. And I don't know, and it still bothers me, because we just rewatched it the other day, and it still bothers me that they never explained that. And they just, like, the Russo brothers just sort of like shrugged their shoulders and said, well, he's Captain America. He does what he wants.
I assume what he did was he went and lived his life in another timeline, then came back to this one to hand over the shield.
Well, yeah, but how did he get back is the thing, right?
Well, they were always planning on him coming back. He had the Pym particle to come back. He just waited 50 years to use it.
Yeah, I don't know, because he didn't come back in the machine. But anyway, like, the point being, like, the reason for this digression is that I don't know if this is going to end up like that, where there's just this big like hole in the time travel plot and you're left to sort of fill in the blanks, or if this is on purpose and there's a plan.
Well, I watched the first 2 episodes with former guest of the show, Commodore Mark Thompson. He's been on Transporter Lock several times. And he reminded me that just because the Kelvin timeline exists doesn't mean it erases or interferes with our timeline. So maybe we stop the Civil War. Voyager proceeds to live in that timeline where there is no Civil War, and the wormhole leads to a different one.
Any number of things can happen. It is Star Trek. We don't get too hung up on the science in Star Trek. That way lies madness.
We should just remember it's just a show and we should sit back and relax.
And at some point, somebody's going to reverse the polarity of something.
That's right.
And exactly. And well, so something that I'm looking forward to this season is I had just been contemplating recently how Star Trek seems to be in constant conversation with itself about whether the Prime Directive is a good idea or if it is dumb and bad. And because, like, within the same show, from one season to the next, nobody can seem to decide, right? You'll get an episode that's all about why we have the Prime Directive and what the importance of it is. And we had that on this show, right? In the first season, we got a whole episode that taught the kid, they didn't use the phrase Prime Directive necessarily, but it taught the kids about the importance of not interfering in stuff that's none of your business, interfering in civilizations that are none of your business. But then, you know, we'll get an episode like that on Discovery, and then the next season turn around and here's an episode about, like, let's wildly violate the Prime Directive. Because in this case, the Prime Directive is dumb and bad. So I'm excited to see if we get the Prodigy equivalent of, like, you see this? This is the rule, and all rules are made to be broken sometimes.
That's an important lesson to learn.
I think so. And my son is just at that age where I'm starting to think about, like, okay, at what point do I explain to him that this particular rule is dumb and bad?
Yeah, civil disobedience.
Exactly. I mean, he's such a little rule follower, and which has helped me out a lot in his early childhood. But as he enters adolescence, I'm like, okay, we need to talk about deciding which rules are going to be broken, which rules are not really that, like, that's an important skill. Like, we don't think about it, but that is a really important skill, is knowing which rules can be bent and which rules can be broken, and, like, which rules, like, there's going to be a consequence for breaking it, but you're willing to live with it. And I think that's going to be important. I'm hoping that becomes a thing on Prodigy as well.
Well, that's one of the great things about Prodigy is that I'm just watching it as a Star Trek show, and I'm loving it for that. And the perspective you bring to this podcast is reminding us that good children's media should also be educational in some way. It doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't need to be the primary function, but there should be something kids get out of it other than just a babysitter.
Well, I think all television in some ways is at its best when it forces us to ask the big questions, right? When it forces us, like, thinking even back to Voyager. I don't remember the name of the episode, but there was an episode where they ran into a civilization where they had, or maybe I think it was actually Deep Space Nine, because now that I think about it, Bashir was in it. When they encountered the planet where people could catch this sort of horrible disease, and once the lesions appeared on your face, you had maybe 3 or 4 days to live, and before long it was going to be horrible, like excruciating pain. And so medical care on this planet basically boiled down to euthanasia, because in those circumstances, that was the absolute most compassionate thing they could think of to do for you. And, we're watching it, and it's making this compelling argument that this is actually, like, as appalled as Bashir is by it, that the doctor on this planet has a point. If you can't cure the disease, why are you letting people suffer, right? Well, my son was so appalled. No, Mom, he's killing them. That's wrong. And I wanted to sort of explain to him, like, no, it's more complicated than that, but I decided to just sort of, like, let him have his moral outrage, because I feel like the ability to be morally outraged is more important. But I think that I think of that episode as, like, a great example of Star Trek asking us all to, like, examine our assumptions and exercise empathy. And I think that Prodigy has a really great opportunity to continue doing that in a more child appropriate way. And that's something that I really appreciate about that first season. I'm looking forward to more of it.
Interesting you mentioned child appropriate, because Deep Space Nine is the darkest of all the Star Treks, and you made your son watch it.
Did I make him watch it, or did I merely watch it before his bedtime? I didn't make him sit. I mean, he would watch it with us, and then sometimes he'd get bored and go play video games in another room. But then he'd find his way back to it. We try to we try to share stuff that we think is appropriate and challenging with him, because our usual cutoff is like, how graphic is the violence, how graphic is like the sexual content, right? I don't give him a complex, I don't want to try to give him nightmares.
Right.
But if it's just like, but if it's weighty adult, like if it's weighty themes, like I'm actually okay with that. Like, let's have those conversations. I'm sure other people will disagree. Maybe I'm a terrible parent for letting my kid watch DS9, but I don't think so.
Well, I hope that all the outraged listeners write in. Now, there is one last question I want to ask you before we wrap up, which is, we have seen just in these first two episodes, Janeway, the Doctor, and Chakotay. On Lower Decks, we saw Tom Paris, and on Picard, we saw Tuvok and Seven of Nine. Where is Harry Kim?
He's still an ensign. Never got promoted. He's like a 50-year-old ensign now.
It's not fair. It's not fair.
It's not fair. Oh, I would love to see Harry Kim. But I think it would be sad. I think it would still be an ensign. That would be like the joke they would make, and that would be a bummer.
I think he should show up. Like, there was the Voyager episode Timeless, I think it was called, where Chakotay and Harry Kim in a future encountered Captain LaForge. You know, I would love for Janeway to be trapped in this wormhole thing, and she has been told to scrap the mission by Jellicoe, and she's apparently doing it anyway. And I would love to see Captain Kim show up and say, "I'm sorry, Admiral. You know how much I admire you, but I need to stop you from doing this." I would love to have Harry Kim show up in some way and as a captain.
The Voyager's in peril, and Captain Harry Kim rides to the rescue.
That'd be swell too.
That'd be fun. Yeah. Well, and that does bring something up that I was wondering as we were getting started tonight. Like, knowing what we know from Picard, and knowing that this takes place probably not that many years before the events of Picard, right? Are the changelings already infiltrating Star Trek right now in this show, or infiltrating Starfleet?
So something I nearly forgot, which was the time. So when the attack on Utopia Planitia happened and canceled the Romulan evacuation, Picard then resigned as a result of that. And then there was a long time that he spent on the Vineyard before Picard season 1 started. So we don't know how long the changelings were infiltrating Starfleet, but I suspect it probably was a pretty quick and covert mission, not years necessarily.
Yeah, that could be. They're probably off like formulating their weird like take over the human brains technology, because they required Picard's body, like his remains, to make it work, and he doesn't even die until the first season of Picard.
Right.
Which is, if you think about like a conspiracy that big, that they're able to like pull that off that quickly, I'm actually really impressed at the efficiency of changeling bureaucracy.
Well, they also had the Borg on their side. They are nothing if not efficient.
That's true. Not a lot of bureaucracy in the Borg.
Any closing remarks before we wrap up this episode of Transporter Lock?
Just that I think that I agree with Rock that the Jeffries tube always leads to trouble, and that's why I'm so excited that the Jeffries tubes are so wide and spacious. They can run like 5 abreast into trouble. I think that'll serve us well this season.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing more of the Jeffries tubes. I'm looking forward to seeing more Voyager characters and more timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff. But most of all, I'm looking forward to reviewing it all with you, First Officer Tiffany Bridge.
I'm really looking forward to that too. I think this is going to be fun.
Yay! Until next time.
See you next time.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes and keep your hailing frequencies open by following us on Twitter @TransporterLock or subscribing to our podcast and email newsletter at transporterlock.com.
I wasn't aware that I needed like a captain's catchphrase because I'm not a captain yet. We didn't plan for this. I'll have to think of one for next time.